Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us today. In this session, we will be discussing the evolving role of governments and the expectations from governments vis-à-vis the citizens, and the capabilities that forward-looking ministries are investing in the future. My name is Tariq Darwish. I'm an executive advisor for public sector at SAP, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Dima and Paolo, who are authors of a recent study published by Strategy and entitled Ministry of the Future. Before we dig into our session, let me start by introducing our guests. First of all, we have Dima Sayess, who's a partner at Strategy and the head of the Ideation Center in the Middle East. The Ideation Center is the think tank that produces thought leadership and publishes studies and reports that help in advancing the Middle East interests. She has 16 years of experience, over 16 years of experience in the public sector in the region, was previously a strategy advisor at the Executive Council in Dubai and advised several ministries. So thank you for being here.
Thank you,
Dima.
Tariq.
And we have Paolo Pigorini, who's a senior partner at Strategy and in the Middle East within the public sector practice as well. Paolo, you have more than 30 years of experience working with governments in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. So, Paolo, let me start with you. You've been working with governments for 30 years, and governments are not really synonymous with innovation and transformation and cutting edge. So, what has changed?
Yeah, so maybe just a bit of context on why we're here having this conversation about Ministry of the Future. Our governments in the region have been working on setting out fairly ambitious plans of how to transform their economies. And they're all captured in this very extensive and deep and sometimes glossy brochures about visions 2035, 2045. But the reality is that unless you also change the governments themselves, then there is a high likelihood that these ambitions will not be achieved. Okay, and that's where the Ministry of the Future comes in. So that's the background for this conversation. Now, in terms of the trends, which I think is your question, we see several, and maybe I'll just name a few. The first one is the increasing demands of the citizens for better services and even personalized services from governments. The second has to do with the realization, I think, of society in general and of government officials as well, that the private sector can be better than government at exercising certain functions that have to do with the operations of government, thereby shifting the focus of the ministries towards the more upstream part of the chain, which is the policy making and the regulations, which is where the government should really play an important role. I'd say the third trend has to do with money, right? With the increasing pressure on public finances. And that in turn leads to new sources of funding for government. And it has to do with, pay for success contracts, making sure that we pay the private sector when they deliver results and outcomes. And I would say the fourth trend that I'd like to mention is the increasing adoption of technologies, which is leading the government on the one side to be able to understand better the citizen needs and even predict them, and the citizens on the other hand to be able to have access to information, thereby increasing transparency and also the accountability of the Ministry of the Future.
And it's very interesting that you mentioned the citizens' need and the focus on citizens. And on that note, I'm interested to know, what are the citizens' needs? Like, what do they expect? What does the Ministry of the Future look like? Can you elaborate on that, please, Dima?
Sure. So building on what Paolo said about the need for personalized service delivery, I think the key features for the Ministry of the Future is citizen centricity and citizen connectedness, because all of the other features actually stem from these two main premises. But what does this actually mean for both the citizens and the government? For the citizen, the government becomes invisible, sort of an unprompted helper that supports them in accessing seamless delivery anytime, anywhere. It's as if the government becomes a platform that is accessible through a unique digital ID, through virtual concierge services, and therefore these boundaries actually disappear. What means for the government is that they have to tap into the power of AI, of real data, to anticipate citizens' needs even before these needs arise, and then push the services accordingly. So this is a change in the mindset for the government from being reactive to being proactive and anticipatory. What this also means is that the government will have to be more action-oriented. It has to be more evidence. It has to be very dynamic and agile in order to be responsive to these needs. What this means also for the citizens is that they will hold the government accountable for holistic well-being. So the notion that the government is only responsible for GDP is becoming more and more outdated, and we see the notion of holistic well-being taking part. And this is why the services and the way the services are delivered will change from being very sectorial, very siloed, to having a whole-of-life service delivery that captures the citizens' needs according to a life journey. So whether I'm entering university, the job market, getting married, retiring, the services will be customized and personalized to my needs. And this has tremendous impacts on the government operations and efficiencies, as we see in Estonia and Singapore, where there are significant productivity gains in terms of the reduced costs of service delivery, reaching up to sometimes 2% of GDP in terms of improvements.
Interesting. And it's very true that we're starting to see some governments experiment and play around with these concepts across. But Paolo, maybe the next question is for you. You've advised governments for 30 years and worked a lot on operating model governance. And you know that governments are typically rigid and slow to move into this transition. So how do you see the governments engaging into such a transition?
So you're right. I mean, there's been a lot of change recently, and I think the recipes of the past where we were trying to help governments organize better and get more efficient will not work in the future. What's needed is completely new set of capabilities to allow for governments to have access to the best talent and then to deploy that talent and organize it in such a way that it has impact. How do you do that? Well, possibly there's going to be, first of all, on the sourcing of talent, there's going to be some platforms. So I'll cite a talent cloud, which will look for the best options, both in government and in the private sector, and trying to bring them into the initiatives that the government has to do. By the way, the talent clouds have been adopted by several governments. Maybe at the forefront was Canada in 2017, which had a talent cloud that did just that looked for the best talent that they had and put it to work for the projects that they needed to do. And actually, pre-COVID, they were already working with this talent at a distance. So, remote working possibly started there for governments. The second, I think, very important feature that changes is that we will go from the very rigid and heavy organizations and even hierarchical organizations of government into flatter, leaner, and much more agile organizations in the future, particularly in the projects and in the, let me call it, front office. But that doesn't diminish the importance of the back office, which will need to support the front office with, technologically powered support services, and potentially some innovation labs. And these are particularly important because they are the way to innovate. Prime example recently in Dubai was the police set up an innovation lab to see how they could improve their security services through the use of artificial intelligence. And then the last thing I want to mention is on the project delivery, where project sprints will probably be adopted by the Ministry of the Future. with all the concepts of design thinking and system thinking that come with it, and with the iterative process of improvement that usually go with these pilots of launching and learning and improving as we go. So, you tell me this is very different from what we see in government today. Absolutely, very, very different from what we're used to seeing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it sounds as if you're talking about a tech company or a startup, and it's very refreshing to see this way of working transiting into the government as well. You describe also with this change an evolving role in the government, right? So governments typically have a one-way relationship with the citizens, where they develop policies that citizens have to abide by, or they are more of a service delivery arm for the citizens. And you describe the transition and change into a more of a participatory kind of a government. Can you give us a bit of examples where this is applied and how it's applied?
Sure. So to your point, Tariq, we will see a shift in the way the governance models are adopted, so that governance models are now more collective, participatory, and experimental. And what this means is that we will see a change from governments governing for citizens to governing with citizens. And with it, a change in the role of governments from being service providers to enablers. But what does this mean practically? It means that the government will start inviting citizens, academia, the private sector, and the third sector to collectively participate in co-designing, co-delivering, and supervising the service delivery. And this is becoming extremely important. Why? Because governments are increasingly faced with what we call wicked problems requiring systemic changes. So food security or climate change or water scarcity can no longer be actually solved at a ministerial, at an individual level. And therefore, these mission-oriented governments and mission-oriented economies will become more and more prevalent. How will this translate? We have already seen a wave of increasing urban labs. They have been adopted in the UK and Singapore and Canada. And these are platforms where citizens, the government, and the private sector co-create through the use, as Paolo mentioned, systems and design thinking. We will see increasing use of crowdsourcing platforms to mobilize ideas and funding and to launch competitions that startups can pitch for the government. We will also see increasing use of participatory budgeting, because the government will want to engage the citizens in trying to voice what are their priority projects. And this is something, for example, that is adopted in Scotland, where they allocate on an annual basis around 1% of their budget to actually, for the citizens to vote on their priorities. So this enables, firstly, the citizens to voice their priorities, and secondly, to hold the government accountable for public funding use. The second aspect of it is decision-making. And the outdated command and control models that have been the default option for governments since the longer term will no longer be acceptable and prevalent. And what will they be shifted or substituted with are shared and distributed decision-making and powers. And what this means is that we will see decision-making shifting more from the top leadership to becoming more and more towards the local level, where frontliners and local authorities will have the decision-making rights. But with it also comes local accountabilities.
It's great to see how governments are really tapping into these capabilities and starting this transition. But as we said, it's not an easy transition for government. So say I'm an executive or a decision maker within the government. Where do I start?
Yeah, so Tariq, the minister, I think behind your question, there is an underlying thought that if we could start from scratch and design it on a white sheet of paper, it'd probably be easier. Exactly. And the issue we have to deal with is the legacy, because Tariq, the minister, obviously has to change for the future, but at the same time has to continue delivering on the day-to-day operations. And that's what our clients, the ministries, the authorities, the entities are telling us. So maybe a few thoughts on how to deal with it. First, it's important to set the north. In consulting, we call it, the vision, or what is it that we're trying to do. And and more than a fluffy high-level vision, actually say what are we going to look like and what is it that we will be doing when we become the ministry or the entity of the future. Some of the characteristics that Dima was commenting on. Then possibly break this into modules and sub-modules that are more manageable from the point of view of making things happen, and use some cross-functional teams to work on these modules and sub-modules and gain success. So I guess what I'm saying is adopt the concepts of the Ministry of the Future to our own transformation and use these teams to transform through these modules. The modules can be around the organization structures that are leaner that we were talking about. They can be around the services or a particular service or a particular journey that we want to work on. But they will show success and they will show that we're changing our ways, and all of a sudden we will become, slowly but surely, the agency of the future that we want to become. Is this easy to do? Well, no, because what I haven't spoken about is the most difficult part, which is changing the mindsets. Okay? The mindset change is a chapter on its own, but I want to say two things about it. The first one is you need the most senior leader of the entity to be behind this change. Without that, we're not going to go anywhere. It's an obvious thing to say, but many times we see only lip service to these changes, and then it's probably not going to work or work in a very, very long time. The second thing to do is to recruit the right people for these modules, particularly the beginning modules, because if you get these cross-functional teams working, people start realizing that this can become the reality of the future. Now, these people, they will need to be coached, because this is not their usual day-to-day. They need to be reassured about their future in the entity, because they're probably releasing their job to become part of one of these teams. And obviously, they need to be incentivized and motivated to make this happen.
Dima, any comments on the enablers to achieve such a transition?
Sure. So I'm fully aligned with Paolo that it actually starts with culture and having to change this culture, which is very siloed, very individualistic, very risk-averse, to one that is more collaborative, one that is more open, that, okay, we can test, we can experiment, we learn, and then we adapt. So this is one. The second, which is at the core of this change, is people. And here I would actually approach it twofold. Firstly, from the qualifications of people that we want to attract, and there will be a shift, because here we are no longer attracting people with specific functions attached to specific departments. People will have to be agile, and as such, we call them people having T-shaped capabilities, meaning that people who have the generalists capabilities and skills, but yet skills that could also support cross-functional collaboration, such as design thinking, such as behavioral economics, data scientists, and so on. But also, the way we manage talent will differ. Because people will no longer be attached to departments, they will be more fluid. Also comes with it the contracts, and also comes with it the way that they are held accountable. They might be in a position where they will choose their leaders, they will choose the sprint projects that Paolo spoke about. And therefore, it's a complete change in talent management. The second is the extreme importance in investing in tools. And by tools, we mean, for example, scenario planning and foresight, because this enables the entities and the ministries to be future ready. Investing in technologies such as AI and blockchain and VR, which are parts and parcels of this transition to a platform government. The third aspect is processes, because we can't expect to rely on our outdated processes when we have to have agile government. And therefore, these agile processes need to be instituted at every level, in how we operate and how we collaborate, on how we do the decision-making. So these, I would say, are the key main enablers. And lastly, but not least, would be the anticipatory regulations and policies, because also we cannot expect the regulations to be rigid when we're trying to promote innovation. We cannot expect policies to be very much boxed in certain sectors or functions when we expect them to be cross-collaborative. So also anticipatory regulations and policies will be extremely important.
I fully agree. I mean, you really need to have a strong core to be able to take these experiments and be able to scale them up from isolated experiments into and be able to properly change the culture as you've described. So having the strong core, the strong systems, the strong people and processes is core to making such a transition. So I want to thank you both for your time and your engaging discussion. It's been a pleasure having you both here.
Likewise. Thank you.
And thank you for everyone joining us today. If you'd like to know more, I'd encourage you to check out the Strategy and Middle East website, where you have an interactive page and you can experience the Ministry of the Future and read more details in the study published there. Thank you.